Welcome, and thank you for participating in the Water Loss Audits webinar today. My name is Ryan Klein, and I'm with the North Central Texas Council of Governments, and I will be moderating today's webinar. Please welcome our speaker, Daniel Rice. Daniel Rice is the Water Loss Program Specialist for the Texas Water Development Board's Municipal Conservation Section. His primary tasks include reviewing, researching, and providing technical assistance and education for all things water loss in Texas. Prior to this position, he was an Assistant Drought Coordinator for the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality's Water Supply Division. He has a bachelor's degree in Environmental Studies and is pursuing a master's degree in Geographic Information Science, both of which are from Texas State University. With that, I will pass over today's webinar to Daniel.
Thank you. All right. As she said, my name is Daniel Rice with the Texas Water Development Board. The Texas Water Development Board is the state agency tasked with administering the Water Loss Audit Program for the state. So this presentation, I'd like to provide sort of an introduction to those requirements set forth by the state and the methodology for water loss auditing that we follow and that we're asking of the utilities to follow when completing those audits. But before we get into water loss auditing, I'd like to give a little background on the Texas Water Development Board for those who may not be familiar. There's the mission statement of the board there. We do more than just water loss auditing. We are a resource agency, basically. Unlike some other agencies which might be regulatory, we provide resources to water and wastewater utilities in the state as well as the public. One of the most important parts of our job here is supporting the regional water planning groups in Texas. There are 16 regional water planning groups. It is a bottom-up approach to water planning in the state. Every 5 years, those regional water planning groups put together a regional water plan, and then that following year, us at the board put together a state water plan combining all 16 of those plans. We also provide a lot of financial assistance to water and wastewater utilities. We have federal and state programs which can provide loans and grants to those utilities. And on top of all that, we also do a lot of science and assistance in the background for the public, one of those including flood assistance. We do a lot of research in the background and support for the groundwater and surface water sources for the state. We also support and do a lot of research for innovative water technologies. And then, of course, while we're here today, we do a lot of work with conservation. And water loss auditing is one of those tools that can help to conserve water at the utility. This map might be a little hard to see from your screen, but we also have it available on our webpage. Going back to those 16 regional water planning groups, what we have done to make it a little easier for the utilities to get in contact with the right person instead of jumping around trying to find someone to talk to or ask a question about our loans or grant programs that we have to offer, and also just projects in general for your utility. We've broken those up into 6 different teams and put a central point of contact for each of those teams. So if you have any questions on loans, grants, projects, for your utility, you can always contact the person in charge of the team which covers your region or where your utility is located. And so with that, we'll start talking a little bit about the water loss audit. TWDB, as I mentioned, is the one that administers the Water Loss Audits Program for the state of Texas. And the reason for that is it is an important part of the water planning process. The regional water planning groups use this information to come up with water management strategies for the regions when coming up with those regional water plans. So to provide a little background on the history of water loss audits in Texas, there's the Texas Water Code where you can find this information, but I've kind of broken it out into the years that these different phases, I would call it, of the water loss audit rules took place, and which all began in 2003 with the legislature requiring that all retail public utilities were required to submit a water loss audit to the Texas Water Development Board once every 5 years. So we received those audits for the 2005, 2010, and also 2015 water loss audit reporting periods. In 2011, they went ahead and enhanced the rule by requiring that all retail public utilities with an active loan or grant with us were required to submit a water loss audit annually to the state. And then in 2013, they added that anyone with over 3,300 connections had to submit annually to the Water Development Board. And so 2013 was kind of a busy year at the legislature when it comes to water loss auditing. They also required that we, the board, establish water loss thresholds. Now basically what this is, it takes the information you have provided in the water loss audit, and we have created system-specific calculated water loss thresholds for loan applicants. When they come in for a loan for a water project, we will compare the water loss audit figures to this water loss threshold, and if the utility is over that threshold, then we are required to require the utility to make sure that they're including some water loss project or program, something that mitigates water loss as part of any loan or grant that they would receive for us for that water project. They also required that the water loss audits be included in the regional water planning process. So we send this information, the water loss audits, every year to those 16 regional water planning groups, and they are required to use the information from the audits as part of their water management strategies. So this is an important process in that whole, important part of this whole regional water planning process. And then one that many utilities are probably familiar with, especially since we're coming up on that July 1st deadline for those consumer confidence reports. The rule in 2013 required that you needed to report to your customers your water loss from your water loss audit that you submitted to the board, and you can do that by telling them in your consumer confidence report, or actually also you could do it in your next bill after submitting the audit. My recommendation is to go ahead and just put it in that CCR, because it's something that you're already submitting. You just add that sentence or two in there saying, basically, this is our water loss, and informing your customers that way. In 2015, the legislature and us, we realized that the thresholds did not take into account the fact that some utilities may already be doing something to mitigate losses. And of course, as many utilities know, it doesn't take just 1 year to lower your water losses. It may take multiple years. It's a long process in many cases. So a waiver program was created for the thresholds. So if a utility is coming in for a loan, they're over the water loss threshold, but they already are doing something and they're showing that they're mitigating those losses, they can submit a waiver to us for that project or for that loan application. And then the most recent water loss audit rule comes just recently for the 2017 legislature, stating that the individual completing the water loss audit must be trained in water loss auditing. And I know today that you're here to listen to me talk about the water loss audits. I do work for the board. I'm the one who reviews the audits. However, this particular webinar does not satisfy that training requirement as the rule was written. We do have water loss audit workshops, which are 4-hour workshops. We provided about 15 of those this past spring to utilities to satisfy that requirement. We're also creating our own webinar that we'll be posting to our webpage sometime in the next couple of months, so keep an eye out for that. And those two different trainings will satisfy that requirement. And basically the requirement goes into effect for next year's water loss audits. And essentially you're going to have to show proof that you have, or an acknowledgement that you have been trained through our training. And so there will be a certificate provided when taking those webinars or those workshops. So this particular one is not. I just wanted to make sure that individuals are aware of that. All right, so were we able to get a polls created for this, Ryan?
Yes, we were.
Okay, if you wouldn't mind pulling up the first poll there about the requirements. So what I'm asking here is what type of utility you are, so we can get an idea of who's required to do the water loss audit and when as well. So we'll give a little bit of time to allow you all to answer this question if you have the opportunity to do so. Okay, I think the poll has ended. So let me just talk about the requirements before we look at this. It looks like we have about 36% that have both greater than 3,300 connections and also have a active financial obligation or loan or grant with us. None of y'all have just that active financial obligation, and a few have greater than 3,300 only. So basically the rules state that all retail public utilities are required to submit a water loss audit to the board. So basically what a retail public utility is, it's a water system providing potable water to their retail customers, homes, businesses, through a meter, and they're using that meter to determine how much they're going to be compensated for that water. So they actually know how much water is being used by the customer and being compensated for it. So it looks like, the ones that have over 3,300 connections, you're going to be required every year to do a water loss audit. Those are due by May 1st of every year. And for those that have an active financial obligation, those systems are also required to submit every year by May 1st. Now, for those that have an active financial obligation only with us, the question that I usually ask systems during my workshops is, what happens whenever you pay off that loan or grant? Well, basically how we view it here, so take for instance, today is June 27th of 2018. If you paid off your grant or your loan today, then you become inactive as far as that financial obligation. However, during the year of 2018, you were active at some point. So you would still have to submit a water loss audit next year. After that, you would revert to a 5-year schedule, which is a prescribed schedule for those systems that have less than 3,300 connections and do not have an active loan or grant with us. So those were the 2005, 2010, 2015. The next one due is by May 1st of 2021 for the 2020 calendar year. Of course, for those systems, we recommend that they do it annually, as you might see through this process that the methodology we have, which follows the American Water Works Association's method, provides a clean approach to auditing that's consistent between utilities and also year to year. So why would a utility want to complete a water loss audit? So basically, a water loss audit is a top-down desktop exercise. And by that I mean you're a water utility, you're already collecting much, if not all, of the information that the audit is requesting. You're collecting how much you produce, how much you sold, you know how many connections you have, population, the length of the main lines in your system. You already collect that information, so as a top-down desktop exercise, you can use that information to fill in the audit with the best information you have. And by desktop, you can just do it at the desktop. You don't need to go out in the field and collect any information because you already have it within your utilities records. So once you've done the audit, how it basically works is you do it year by year by year and kind of see your results, see your inefficiencies, your deficiencies within your system, and then start to make steps towards controlling your water losses using the information that the audit has provided. And hopefully, once you start mitigating those losses, you start to lower that water loss, and you can see your system can run a little bit more efficiently. You're using less electricity to push water that's just been going to get lost. Same with chemicals. You're using less chemicals for water that once was going to get lost, now is going to that beneficial use. We also see water loss as a supply here at the board. It's a way that you can extend supplies at your system and possibly not have to go after that new source. It's sort of a drought-proof source. The water loss audit also has quite a few things in it that can help a utility, quite a few tools. And one of those is the assessment scale, which I'll kind of touch on a little bit here later. But that's an important piece because it will help a utility to target the assets within their system and then potentially find ways to upgrade those assets. The water loss audit also helps to save the utilities money. Not only does it give you the volume of water losses, it puts that volume into a dollar figure to get an idea of how much money are we losing because of these leaks, how much money are we losing because these customer meters are not running accurately. And then, of course, it's required. But what I mean here is that if you're coming in for a loan or a grant with us and you have not completed your most recently required water loss audit, we can't actually move forward with that loan or that grant application. Now, it doesn't mean we're going to stop it dead in the water and say, come back another time. We're going to work with you. We're going to make sure we're getting the information we need and work with you on getting that submitted to us. And then we talked about regional water planning. It's an important part of that process as well. So we know who has to submit. We know why we might want to submit a water loss audit or complete one. How do you submit a water loss audit to the board? Well, one of those things that the legislature required of us was to create an easy application for the utilities to complete the reports that are required of them from our agency. And many of you might be familiar with our water loss use and conservation application, where many of you for many years have been filling out the water use survey, and we've included now the water loss audit a couple of years back. And between those two reports, they connect a lot of the common data. So there's less stuff that you have to continually fill out the same information. It will automatically transfer that information between the reports. And then for those that have to do water conservation plans and the annual reports that go along with it, we've also included that into this online application with the similar common information also transferring between those reports as well. So the water loss audit methodology, which we follow, which comes from the American Water Works Association. If you're familiar with that methodology, our water loss audit follows that to almost a T. There are a few things that are slightly different as far as the worksheet or the form goes. AWWA, which is American Water Works Association, has a similar form to ours. They have a spreadsheet and we have an online application. The terminology and everything might be slightly different, but it all means the same thing. So I want to get an idea of where people stand on the definition of water loss. So I'm going to pull up another poll here for you all to answer. And the question is, what is water loss? Is it an unaccounted for water? Is it water in minus water out? Is it both of those two? Is it total system input volume minus total authorized consumption? Real losses plus apparent losses? Both of those two? Or is it all of the above? So I'll give it a few seconds here to get some responses in. And if you're familiar with the American Water Works Association's free audit software, they have a lot of great tools that can help with water loss auditing, water loss control. However, the worksheet that they have is not the one that you can submit to us. You have to submit using our worksheet to satisfy the requirements. All right, I got the responses back now. It looks like a majority chose all of the above. One chose unaccounted for water. One chose both A and B. One chose system input minus total authorized. So the most popular answer I receive at my workshops is that the answer is all of the above. Or I might get a few that say unaccounted for water, which totally makes sense. I understand where those folks are coming from. But as I've mentioned, we follow the methodology put forth by the AWWA. And in that methodology, they do not use unaccounted for water anymore. Try to get that to pull up. Okay. So the answer here would be both D and E, total system input volume minus total authorized consumption, and real losses plus apparent losses. And the reason why they don't use unaccounted for water anymore, using this method, everything can be accounted for. And we're going to see that here in a second why. Another reason is that there's no standard definition for unaccounted for water. One utility might think that flushing is an unaccounted for use. Another might actually meter their flushing, or they might have a good calculation for it. So they might think that that is accounted for. So those two utilities coming up with water loss are not calculating it the same way. So it's not a consistent approach as this method actually has put together. And one of the things about the water loss audit is that it has standard definitions for things. So yes, it is water in and minus water out. However, there are terms for those particular items within the utility. For water in, we define that as total system input volume. And basically what that is the volume of treated water from the utility's own sources corrected for because of those meters not being completely accurate. And then it adds any water that was purchased that was treated and then corrects for that because the meters are not 100% accurate. And then subtracts out any water that's sold to another water system, treated water sold to another water system, and corrects for that because those meters are not completely accurate. So it's not just what the meters read, but also takes into account the meter inaccuracies as well, because that's water that can be lost and used within the system that your numbers are not telling you about, that the well numbers or the well readings are not telling you about. And then it subtracts out the water out, but we actually call it authorized consumption. And we're going to see what that actually looks like here on the next slide, which is our water balance. Now, this is not the worksheet, but it does show the meat of the information that is being completed within the water loss audit worksheet. Everything starts out over on the left, and by balance, it means that everything should balance back to how much water went into the system. And that would be your total system input volume. And then you can break that out into total authorized consumption, or whatever else is left over would be water loss. So for total authorized consumption, that can be broken into 4 distinct types. There's billed metered, billed unmetered, unbilled metered, and unbilled unmetered. So billed metered is likely going to be the largest volume of authorized consumption at the utility. This is the volume of water that you sold to your customers. You received compensation for, and it passed through a meter. Billed unmetered is going to be any water you sold, however, it didn't pass through a meter. Instead, you used either a truck or a tank size or some other estimate to determine how much you're going to charge that customer. And then unbilled metered, typically we see these, especially at municipalities. This is water for city parks or city hall, other institutions like that are not billed for, but it does pass through a meter. And then unbilled unmetered is basically flushing and fire department use, depending on how that water use is, whether it's metered and whether it's billed or not. But typically it's going to be flushing and fire department use at many utilities. So those 4 different types are going to add together and give you how much was authorized for use within the retail public utility. And whatever's left over after we take the total system input and subtract out the total authorized consumption gives us our total water losses, which can be broken out into 2 distinct types. There's actually 2 distinct types of water loss. The first one is total apparent losses. Now, this isn't actual physical water leaking from the system. This is basically paper losses because of data inaccuracies within the billing system or the customer meters, or because someone stole water from you. So customer meter loss, the utility would put in an estimate for the average accuracy of the customer meters and their meter population. Then they can also put in a volume for the errors within the billing system's data. And then they can also put in an estimate for the volume of water that someone stole from them. That would be unauthorized consumption. And then the other type of water loss is total real losses. Now, this is the physical leaks occurring within the system. And on our water loss audit worksheet, we have that broken out into 2 different types of real losses. We allow the utility to input how much volume of water did they find and fix within that given year that they're reporting for. And that would be your reported breaks and leaks, or reported losses. And then there's your unreported losses. This is going to auto-calculate actually on the form the remainder of water loss after those other types of losses have been accounted for, and give you an idea of what is leaking from the pipeline, from the pipes, that was not found by the utility. And then over on the right, This breaks out the water loss into whether it was revenue, or the balance into whether it was revenue water or non-revenue water. So the industry, AWWA, the board, has been trying to get folks to move away from the terminology for unaccounted for water and wanted to replace it with something so they had something to use. And that terminology instead now is non-revenue water. So it's water that you did not receive revenue for. So that's your water loss and also any unbilled authorized consumption. So these are things that you can, if you reduce them, your water losses or unbilled authorized consumption, you can potentially return revenues to the system. So basically that balance is what you would need to fill out on the water loss audit. The water losses, a lot of that stuff will calculate, but there are some inputs to identify, especially like customer meter accuracy, to identify that volume of loss. Once we've identified the volumes of loss for apparent and for real, the water loss audit gives you some performance indicators to use to help you to track your water loss from year to year, to use to benchmark with other utilities, and use those apparent losses and real losses. So on the sheet, you'll see that there is an apparent losses normalized whenever you get into the online system and see the worksheet. Basically, that takes your apparent loss volume, it divides it by the number of connections in your system, and divides it by 365 days. So this is the volume of data inaccuracies per connection per day, apparent losses per connection per day. And then real losses does a similar thing here. There are actually 3 different types, though, of real loss performance indicators. The first one being the infrastructure leakage index. Now, this performance indicator is only going to calculate and is only good for utilities that have over 3,000 connections and also have over 16 connections per mile. Now, so that's going to be those more dense, larger utilities. How the infrastructure leakage index is calculated, it takes the volume of real loss from the water loss audit and divides it by an unavoidable annual real loss, or UARL. Now, the unavoidable annual real loss is calculated based on inputs from the system that they put into the audit. And basically that calculation was created from research done on a bunch of utilities that were performing the best of the best in leakage control. So they were doing everything they could to minimize, to reduce their leakage as far down as possible. However, inevitably, they still had water losses. So from that research, this calculation was created to identify for other utilities how much, at least a general idea of how much water can a utility lose even if they tried their best to recover it all, to stop it from happening. So the infrastructure leakage index takes the ratio between what's actually being lost to that unavoidable real loss. And this is the industry's currently their best tool for tracking and benchmarking of real losses is by the infrastructure leakage index. Now, some utilities might not actually have an ILI, but they will have one of the other 2 types of performance indicators. The first one would be the real loss per connection per day, which is that second one there, real loss volume divided by number of connections divided by 365 days. Now, if a utility has over 32 connections per mile as their connection density, this is the performance indicator that will calculate on the worksheet for them. And they can use it to track their water loss from year to year as well. And then for any system that has less than 32 connections per mile, they would look at the real losses from the real loss per mile per day, calculated real loss volume divided by length of main lines divided by 365 days. So these will be auto-calculated and put into the right spot on the online worksheet when you're filling it out. So if there's anything you need to actually input yourself. But it is a great tool to use to track your water loss from year to year. But not only do we look at the volume as a performance, we also look at the financial performance that's occurring at the utility to help the utility to identify what is the most cost-effective way for us to reduce these losses. Is it even beneficial for us to spend money if we're only losing such and such amount of money because of these losses? So it takes the apparent loss volume and multiplies it by the cost that the customer is paying for the water, at least per 1,000 gallons, and gives you a cost of apparent losses. And then it does the same thing for the real loss side. It takes the total volume of real losses, multiplies it by a production cost, and gives you the cost of real losses. And then you add those two together, you can get a total cost of water loss, which will auto-calculate on the water loss audit. And then on the water loss audit, we still provide information that you might not see on the AWWA worksheet. We provide the water loss percentage. So how we calculate that is taking your total water loss volume, we divide it by your total system input volume, and that will give you, and then multiply it by 100, and that gives you your water loss percentage. We also provide you with your gallons per capita per day. So that is your total system input volume divided by your retail population divided by 365 days. So for many folks that have to do the water conservation plans, they're very familiar with the GPCD, and this is one of those things that they need to set a goal for within that water conservation plan, utility profile, annual report, all mention the GPCD, and so it is provided on the water loss audit as well. Another one of those tools that is needed to set a target for is the GPCD loss, which comes from this water loss audit. It takes your total water loss volume, divides it by your retail population, and divides it by 365 days. So these are on the water loss audit for the utilities to use. All right, so at this point, if you were filling out an audit, you would have completed everything on there except for one thing, and that is the assessment scale. Now, the assessment scale is basically asking the utility what the conditions are at the system that provided the data that they input into the audit. So there are 20 fields on the water loss audit which are asking for an assessment scale, and that scale is 0.5 to 5, and there's actually an assessment scale table which helps the utility to identify what number they need to choose for that assessment. That assessment scale table also provides some information on how they can improve their data collection and into the future to possibly improve that score. And this water loss, or this assessment scale, is a very important part. It helps the utility not only because you have these numbers, you have the volumes, but now you also can kind of identify, are we even confident in these numbers? Because if you're not confident in your water loss volumes, where they came from, then it might not be worthwhile moving forward with any water loss control projects or programs. So to give you an idea about this assessment scale, without the text that's actually in the water loss, or within the assessment scale table, this is basically what the assessment scale table would look like. There's a different table for each of those different 20 fields. They each have different statements within the boxes as it relates to that particular field. But basically, if you have a 0.5 as your assessment for that field, that identifies that you're less confident in the data for that line. And then the further up you go, the more confident you are showing that you are in the data you provided for that line. And then below on the table, we'll show you steps to improve. So I've taken a little snapshot that's, now this table is quite detailed and it has a lot of text in it, so I was only able to get the 0.5 to 3.5 on here to be able to see in a presentation. But basically how a utility goes about identifying what score works or what score they would score themselves for that particular line, we can look at the length of main lines, line 6 on the water loss audit, which is the first field that a utility is going to have to assess. So if a utility filled out that they have 150 miles of main line, they need to start out by looking at the current conditions within their system and looking at 0.5 as it states there. Are there poorly assembled and maintained paper as-built records of existing water main installations, which makes the accurate determination of the system pipe length impossible? So the utility, for the 150 miles, estimated it. Now, they would choose 0.5 if that was the case. They would continue up the scale And if they meet or exceed any of the statements within that field, for instance, if I do better than what it says there in point 5, go on to 1, if I meet or exceed what it says in number 1, so on and so forth, until I get to a point where I do not meet or exceed, and then I choose the score. So that is a real basic overview of the assessment scale. It's a little bit more detailed than the time that I have here, but as far as our workshops and our webinar goes, we'll provide a little bit more in-depth detail, and we'll also satisfy the requirement as well for the new training requirements. To touch a little bit, though, on that assessment, something that's been very popular in the water loss audit field is the validation of water loss audit data. So not only would the utility assess their own conditions within the system, they could potentially have another party or a person who has been trained in asking these particular questions about where the data actually came from, to get an idea of whether the data is as accurate as the person who filled out the audit believes. So there are a few actual states around the nation who have implemented rules requiring that water loss audits be validated on top of just being completed. And that validation process helps to identify and evaluate uncertainties in the water loss audit data. So it's providing a separate set of eyes looking at it, and it helps to provide an accurate assessment of the data collection procedures, and it helps to ensure that the utility is effectively setting targets and control measures because they're able to know the true confidence they have in the data they're providing. And this table, of course, is probably not very easy to read, but we do have it available from our webpage. And this comes from, it's adapted from the American Water Works Association, and this is the Water Loss Control Planning Guide. So going back to that assessment scale, like I mentioned, there were 20 of them. We take those 20 scores and we can come up with a total for the entire audit. So once we have a total score for the entire audit, that gives the utility an idea of how confident they are overall in the water loss audit. And using this water loss control planning guide and that total score, they can identify what steps they may feel comfortable taking in setting targets and controlling their water loss. So if you have, basically what this table is getting at is if you have a very low confidence in that data, then you probably do not want to move forward with any control projects. You might want to move forward with correcting that data and maybe doing some groundwork towards improving just the whole process and the auditing process. And then not setting any targets as well, because you're setting targets based on data you're not confident in. And then so on and so forth as you increase up the sort of the chain of where you fall along the line of your confidence in your data. So I mentioned about the water loss performance indicators. I mentioned that we use the infrastructure leakage index, real loss per connection per day, real loss per mile per day, but I did not mention that percentage as a tracking tool. And the reason I didn't mention it as a tracking tool, I just mentioned that we provide it, is that we don't recommend it in tracking your water loss from year to year. Now, I put up here on this slide is a hypothetical situation, but basically the point it's trying to get across is that water loss percentage is too finicky to the water demands within the system, which being from Texas, being a utility in Texas, we all know that demand can change drastically from year to year, from season to season, because of our different weather patterns that we typically see. So how we view it here is, on the left is 2015. This hypothetical system had 2 billion gallons that went into the system, 1.65 billion gallons that was authorized for use. So we were able to calculate a water loss of 350 million gallons. And then if we do the percent of water loss calculation, that is 17.5%. And then take, for instance, in 2016, since we want to track, we're going to do our 2016 audit, and take, for instance, that nothing changed with the utility. They sold 2 billion, or they produced 2 billion, sold 1.65 billion, except for one thing. They had one new customer come into the system, and they produced 100 million gallons and sold 100 million gallons to that customer. So if you do the calculation for water loss, that is 350 million gallons. But if you do the calculation for the percent of water loss, or water loss percentage, it's 16.7%. It almost improved by a whole percentage point, and all this utility did was sell more water. It didn't actually tell the utility that they improved in their water loss overall. What did not change is the performance indicators for real loss and for apparent loss listed there below. These are the preferred tools to use for tracking from year to year for water utilities when viewing the water loss audit. So just to kind of give you an idea of what these tools are, again, they're going to be auto-calculated on your water loss audit once you complete it. So we're using apparent loss per connection per day. All systems use the same. Infrastructure leakage index only for those larger systems, but it is the preferred method for tracking water real losses, the leakage in the system. And then also real loss per connection per day or real loss per mile per day. And just to touch a little bit more on that infrastructure leakage index and setting targets and tracking, well, basically if you're tracking, you might want to set a target if you want to control your losses. And there is a guidance document. Again, this is available on our water loss audit webpage. Basically, and it's a little bit more detailed than what I've provided here. But basically what it's getting at is a utility can find at least a range where they might want to set a target based on 3 different criteria at their utility: a financial, an operational, and a water resource consideration. So if a utility has a water resource which is limited, and to become more efficient, they would the only thing they could do is increase their infrastructure, and it's costly to purchase or to produce that water. Well, then if it's costly, then you can spend the money probably to get your water loss down pretty low, down to that 1 level potentially. So you can set a target within the 1 to 3 range, and that would be a reasonable approach to setting a target for ILI. And then if you had a reasonable cost for your water resource, your long-term needs are met, and you have a sufficient supply of water, then you would want to possibly set a range of 3 to 5. You can always do better, but economically speaking, it might not be beneficial to go beyond that range. And then so on and so forth. A 5 to 8 means that you have a lot of water and you're not paying anything for it, basically. And if you're setting targets of above 8 for the infrastructure leakage index, that's actually not a recommended approach. You might have an ILI above 8, but we recommend setting a target somewhere in that 1 to 8 range, depending on your particular system. And then if the system has below 1 or sets a target below 1, what that indicates to me is that that system is performing better than the best in leakage control, because a 1 ILI is that 1-to-1 ratio of the system's real loss volume to that unavoidable calculation. So that system is either performing better than the best, or there's actually data errors, which we've seen is actually more likely the case with some of those audits. So if you have less than 1 on your ILI on your water loss audit, it'd be good to take a look at some of the data to ensure that it's as accurate as it can be. And getting pretty close here, so I've covered basically real quick overview of the water loss audit requirements, the water loss audit methodology, but it all kind of also ties together with our other reports, the water use survey, the water loss audit, and the water conservation plans all tie together. And so I mentioned a little bit about the total gallons per capita per day and the water loss gallons per capita per day. I did want to mention that also you need to set if you are a utility that has to do a water conservation plan, then you also have to set a residential GPCD within your water conservation reports, so aside from the water loss audits. The reason I put this up here is because many utilities that have a water conservation plan are coming up on a 5-year update, and where you would have to set new targets and goals, or at least verify that the ones you have are still current. And that deadline for many of those systems is coming up, and it's due by May 1st of 2019. So if you're one of those systems, you're probably coming up pretty close in the next less than a year to have to get that water conservation plan revised along with the utility profile. And just to give you an idea of those 3 reports, so I've got those 3 reports. I just want to give you an idea of who's required and when. So the water use survey is required of all water systems, and we even require it from water users in the state that aren't even water systems. But that's due every year regardless of size, financial status with us. That's due by March 1st of every year. The water loss audit, we kind of covered that already, but if you have over 3,300 connections or an active financial obligation with us, those are due by May 1st of every year. If you don't meet those 2 criteria, then you would be required once every 5. The next one due is by May 1st of 2021 for the 2020 calendar year. And then for the water conservation plan, a utility is required to do a water conservation plan if they have over 3,300 connections, or they have an active financial obligation over $500,000 with us, or they have a surface water right with the TCEQ. And so if you have a water conservation plan, then you also need to do the utility profile once every 5 years along with it. And then you also need to do a water conservation annual report, which is due every year by May 1st. Basically, that is showing how the utility has implemented those strategies within the water conservation plan. We do have a lot of resources available for utilities. We have leak detection equipment that we can loan out to utilities for free. The only cost of the utility is shipping it back to us. We ship it at our cost, you ship it back at yours. The loan period runs for about 30 days. It's an acoustic sounding equipment. Basically, you go out and you listen for leaks. We provide a little bit of assistance along with that on how to use it, but basically we're providing the equipment. You can always give us a call. We're here to help. We help utilities every single day with the water loss audit and all the other reports and other things that we provide. Our website is a great place to go to. We have tons of links, tons of documents, tons of reports, tons of information that we've provided. And then I'd like to give a shout out to the water loss audit workshops, which we typically do in the spring, and that will satisfy that new training requirement. If you have any questions on those, you can always call or email me. My email and phone number are there and available for you. And we will also, again, be putting up that webinar that we will be creating and posting to our webpage, which is different than this current webinar, sometime in the next few months, sometime in the early fall of 2018. And with that, I'm going to pass it back over to Ryan.
Thank you again to all of you who joined us today. Today's presentation and recording will be made available on our website, which is on this slide here at the bottom on our Water Resources site. This webinar is now over.